We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, but that all famously scribed 244 years ago was not designed to include all of us. As Frederick Douglass asked in 1852, what to the slave is the 4th of July? This week, we may be wrestling with questions of our own. What does it mean to sing about the land of the free when we hear the jarring echoes of George Floyd calling for his mama? How do we celebrate life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness when Breonna Taylor lives no longer? In this moment of national reckoning inspired by Black Lives Matter, we are invited to revisit the silenced and suppressed stories of our past as the United States and as the United Methodist Church. The legacy of enslavement and settler colonization lives on in present-day white supremacist ideology and in the many manifestations of systematic racism. We see it in the historic practice of redlining and in the dramatic black-white wealth gap that continues today. We see it in the historic practice of Native American boarding schools and in the modern-day caging of children at the U.S.-Mexican border. We see it in Jim Crow segregation and in the new Jim Crow mass incarceration. We see it in the lynched bodies of Emmett Till and Ahmaud Arbery. Systematic racism acts through the policies and practices of our institutions to oppress people of color, while simultaneously privileging white people with unearned power. It is an evil that undermines the God-given humanity of us all, sabotaging the vision of koinonia and strangling the heart of the beloved community. The blood of Abel cries out from the ground. In the coming hour, we will explore the past and present of systemic racism in our nation and our church, unearthing the dual legacies of racist harm and anti-racist resistance. In so doing, we confess our sins, name our pains, and seek a future of reparation, committing ourselves again to accept the freedom and power God has given us to resist evil, injustice, and oppression, even yet today.
In the United Methodist Church. My name is Erin Hawkins, and I'm the moderator for today's discussion. The Dismantling Racism Pressing On to Freedom initiative is an invitation for all United Methodists, all churches all around the world to get involved, to be engaged, to educate themselves about the need for us to eradicate racism now. Today, we're going to start our work in discussing these matters with an unpacking of our historical narrative as a church and as a nation in the United States. This effort is brought to you by the collaborative work of the Council of Bishops, the General Commission on Religion and Race, the General Board of Church and Society, United Methodist Women, and with the strong support of the General Commission on Archives and History and the other general agencies, including UMCOM, which has been so gracious to host this platform. This is what is important for us to take a look at, especially at this time where in the United States, we will be just in a couple of days acknowledging a day of independence for the nation. It'll be an opportunity for us to reflect on freedom, except we all know the story, and that freedom was not made possible for everyone from the very beginning of our history. And even today, in the streets all across the United States and the world, there are people of color, black, brown, indigenous, people who are crying out for freedom. And so as we reflect on our history, as we talk about the importance of this ideal of freedom, we thought that it would be a good opportunity for us to pause before we celebrate, before we say that we're independent, to reflect on whose independence are we really celebrating? What does the historical narrative around racism mean in the United States and in the church? How do we reinterpret, reimagine what it means for us to be free indeed? So today I have invited a group of Methodism's best and brightest to help us with this historical conversation. This first town hall does center on the history of the U.S., but the initiative, Dismantling Racism, Pressing On to Freedom, is not just a U.S. initiative. It's not just an invitation for us in the U.S. The United Methodist Church in all places all around the world will be engaged in conversation, encouraged, challenged to also take up the work of dismantling systemic racism, resisting white supremacy in all of the places and the forms that it exists in our world. But first, let me introduce to you those who have assembled today to lead us in this conversation. Reverend Dr. Bobby McLean is a pastor, a scholar, a pillar of the Black community, of Black Methodism. He is a teacher of worship and preaching. He is a social activist. His works, his lectures on the involvement of African Americans and their experience in the Methodist movement is seminal to our understanding. He's written books such as Black Methodists, Blacks in the Methodist Church, and Heritage and Hope that are seminal in our historical understanding. We've got Dr. Lisa Dellinger, who was recently awarded a PhD in theology, history, and ethics from Garrett Evangelical Seminary. Dr. Dellinger is a well sought after speaker and thought leader on the subjects of racism, on the subject of colonialism, settler colonialism, indigenous peoples, feminism, the doctrine of discovery. These are all just a part of the expertise that she brings to us today. Reverend Fred Day is the General Secretary of the General Commission on the Archives and History, whose mission is to serve in the ministry of memory for the United Methodist Church. It's so important for us to think about this ministry of memory because it also is what allows us to anticipate our future. Reverend Day has pastored churches all throughout his career as an elder in the United Methodist Church, including pastoring the historic St. George's Church, which is a very important inflection point in the racial history of the United Methodist Church, because it was there that Richard Allen departed, walked out of the church because of the racism experienced as part of the Methodist movement. And we also have Dr. Allison Green, who is a teacher of American religion at Emory School of Theology. And her interests include American religions and their impact on subjects like race and ethnicity, wealth and poverty, environmentalism, the American South. And she brings a host of expertise as well to this conversation, especially on the political front. So thank you all so much for agreeing to be with us in this conversation. For those of you who are watching us right now and would like to submit a question as you hear this discussion, please feel free to click the button and to send your question in. We will reserve some time at the end of our discussion for us to field some questions. So we welcome your submission of questions for our discussion today. So I'd like to start with Dr. Dellinger, because so much of what we are experiencing in the cries for freedom and to dismantle racism involve the racialized violence and terror that have been visited upon Black and Brown people. And when we think about the origins of racism and of colonialism, not only in the US, but all around the world, it does, the origins of that are always rooted in the displacement, violence against indigenous peoples. So we can't have a conversation around unpacking racism, the history of racism, unless we're willing to go back to the origin story of how settler colonialism and the ways in which indigenous people are taken from their land, exploited, harmed, so that new empires can be built. This is a part of what we must contend with. So I want to start with you to take us back to that, to help us to understand not only in the US, but also in the United Methodist Church, how this idea of settler colonialism has impacted us historically and what it means for the Christian witness. Why do we need to be looking at this history even now?
Well, I'd like to begin by talking about what we mean by settler colonialism. In the US, the colonial ambitions of the quote-unquote founders of the United States looked to permanent settlement. They were intent on making this land what they termed the New Jerusalem, the New Promised Land. And as such, when they encountered indigenous persons, they were cast as the Canaanites to the Euro-Christian foil of the new Israelites. So there was this whole narrative of conquest, and in order to do that, you had to displace the indigenous people to such a degree that their humanity was pushed aside, and that the Euro-white Christian, often male, ideal citizen became the norm for what it means to be a quote-unquote American. We even see in the Declaration of Independence that they're one of the reasons in which they are founding this wonderful nation is to defeat the merciless Indian savages that they've encountered, who are warlike and unable to function with the same kind of humanity that is known in European Enlightenment tradition. This goes all the way back to an understanding of the need for separation of church and state, and yet totally ignoring it. The original Spanish invaders looked to the Papal Bull from 1493, in which Alexander VI proclaimed that anyone who was encountered who was not a Christian king, those lands became subject to the Christian Catholic Church and could be seized. In the process, native bodies were also seized for genocide, but also for slavery. Columbus was very much interested in lining his coffers through human suffering with native bodies. And then later we see in the case law of the U.S., Chief Justice refers to the paganness of indigenous people and that particular bull as a reason for the U.S. being able to confiscate native territories, lands, resources, and bodies. and it becomes a justification. Today, we have over 500 federally recognized nations in the U.S., Native nations. Each one of those has their own language, their own history, their own cultural practices, their own spiritual practices, through mechanisms of colonialism and wed with narratives of mission and conversion or death. You have many Native peoples who identify as Christian and have no access to their own spiritual histories and creation stories and founding beliefs. So within this, I want to emphasize the fact that Native peoples are complex. Their experiences are widely underappreciated in the sense of their complexity. But what has been a unifying experience for Native peoples, not necessarily a positive one, has been this sense of displacement, this sense of being a stranger in a strange land, and the strange land is your home. And church is often that experience for Native peoples, because the church and government collaborated in projects of not only massacre, such as we see at the Sand Creek Massacre, which was led by a Methodist pastor against women, children, and elderly people. We have the long history of boarding schools across the continent in which missionaries rounded up indigenous children and youth, forced them to practice Euro-American cultural practices over their own native, were forcibly separated from their parents, experienced all kinds of abuse, and in some cases even death, all under the guise of spreading the gospel. We still see repercussions of that in generational trauma. And moving into today's time, many of our indigenous people are empathetic and outraged by the practices we see still happening, in which children and their families who are seeking asylum in the land of the free are being forcibly separated, and children are being put in cages on our borders, and suffering through a pandemic and reports of abuse and other problems. All of this is reminiscent of what was experienced in boarding schools, and causes many to question that allegiance that Christianity and has wedded to imperial power. So yeah.
Well, it really leaves us in this place where we see remnants of the past being played out even today. And I think that that's true for many communities of color who've been tracing their historical narrative and the challenges of racism that have been embedded within their historical narrative, seeing those same dynamics, those same practices being played out even today. And so I think the recurring theme of how racism is enacted on communities of color we can tie that directly back to, as you've said, what's happened with Indigenous people in this country and all over the world, which really leads me to this question about the role specifically of the United Methodist Church, Reverend Day, because we, as Dr. Dellinger said, this history, this colonial mission enterprise by which we spread the gospel at the expense of indigenous people, at the expense of Black people, at the expense of so many who've been on the margins, is a part of not only the history of America, but also of the church. You know, just starting from the colonies and marching across the frontier in a way with blood on our hands to spread the gospel is a part of the Methodist, is part of our history, is a part of our narrative. It's one that we need to confront. Here's the thing: we've also done a lot of good in the world. We continue to do a lot of good. So there's this complicated relationship, particularly when it comes to the matter of race and racism, which includes narratives that are both empowering but highly oppressive. At the same time, simultaneously, those parts of our history are true. Unpack that a little bit for us. Help us to get a deeper sense, because not everyone is aware of, you know, our history as a church, how we have played to our highest and our basest natures, and how that should impact even the church that we aspire to be today.
Erin, thank you for the invitation, and to my fellow panelists, just the delight to be with you in this important moment in Methodist history and American history, and the voices that we bring to deepen people into better understanding about what it means to be Christian, what it means to be United Methodist, what it means to be American. Methodist history is indeed, Erin, as you've suggested, full of both pride and shame in terms of its racial history. And in stark contrast and illuminating irony to Dr. Dellinger's teaching us about the context of settler colonialism, America and Methodism is born and develops grounded in the largely white European Enlightenment and First Great Awakening ideals of human freedom and natural inborn human rights. Freedom is in the air these white Europeans are breathing when they come to and settle the New World. And John Wesley speaks their zeitgeist when he says in his Thoughts on Slavery in 1743, liberty is the right of every human creature as soon as he breathes the vital air, and no human law can deprive him of that right which he deserves from the law of nature. Yet, while freedom may have been in the air, as America is being founded and the Methodist Church is being born in America, human bondage is gaining ground. America's economic and social growth and development depends increasingly on chattel slavery and indentured servitude and the displacement of America's indigenous peoples. Enslaved Blacks and Native Americans are considered to be inferior by white Europeans. This inferiority stems from Africans and Native Americans' perceived otherness and the cruel pragmatisms implicit in master-slave relationships of dominance. This relationship erodes the Enlightenment and Great Awakening evangelical consensus, yielding to the all-too-common American racial paradigm: prejudice and perceived inferiority plus power equals racism and white superiority. This is the context in which the Methodist Church is born. On my wall at the archives is this replica of a slave gravestone from 1780, Attleboro, Massachusetts, in the North, not in the South, in the North. A white slave owner writes on the tomb, "In memory of Caesar, here lies the best of slaves, now turning into dust. Caesar the European craves a place among the just. His faithful soul has fled to realms of glory light, and by the blood of Jesus shed is changed from black to white." January 15th, he quitted this life in the 77th year of his age. So there is pride and shame in our history. And as to your question of it, Methodists can take great pride in their uniquely egalitarian message of God's love to be experienced by all, and that this love divine, all loves excelling, that they message is supposed to be impartial and no respecter of persons, as Francis Asbury writes in his journal in 1771, worshiping with Black Africans. But the core message and spirited Methodist worship that brought Blacks and Native Americans in increasing number to Methodist societies and churches in ways unprecedented in other contemporary religious denominations leads to the dilemma question of our history, which is, what do we do with these people when they come? What do we do with our Black people? What do we do with our brown people? And this leads to a history of shame. At the same time, there is shame to be named in ways that Methodism, egalitarianism is not unconditional, that full acceptance does not happen, let alone equality or dignity. In the period, Black preachers like Harry Hoosier are extremely effective, inspiring, and entertaining, but sleep in the carriage when their white traveling companion preacher counterparts get to stay in the big house. Or the fact that there are separate class meetings held at off hours, as Richard Allen writes about, not to mention the segregated seating arrangements of Absalom Jones and James Varick and Richard Allen, and the eventual so-called African galleries that separate Black from white in churches. There are separate communion tables, then separate Black churches arising, and eventually autonomous Black denominations developing when white hostility gets to be too much for Black people to stand. But always under, for the large part in the Methodist Church, under white supervision and control. Ordinations to the diaconate only are sparse and on the sly and left out of early disciplines for fear of offending certain constituencies. In a slavery-split Methodist church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South shunts off its Black churches to a separate colored Methodist Episcopal Church. But the churches in the North are just as segregated as those south of the Mason-Dixon line. When Methodists reunite in 1939, what seals the deal is a segregated central jurisdiction, a means to segregate the Black church's constituency into separate conferences with separate elections of bishops and conducting their own business. We're not even to Brown versus the Board of Education and legalize separate but equal yet. We're just separate, period, at this point in time. So there's reason for pride in a certain inclusiveness from John Wesley and our seminal spirit, but shame that the egalitarian and inclusive spirit bowed to the prevalent social norms of its day: segregation, inferiority, white supremacy. There is a history of missed opportunities, of compromise, of caving to segregationists, and a failure for not allowing the gospel to lead and shape the culture, but instead Methodists and other Christians being the culture's wagging tail. And for all of our amazing grace, how sweet the sound singing, egalitarian theology, we have not matched lip service with true acceptance and equality. The United Methodist Church in its antecedents records with race relations is not among its proudest achievements. And beyond Black and white, the record extends to Native Americans and the boarding schools and outright massacres that Dr. Dellinger has already mentioned. Hispanic Latino Americans laboring under their own demeaning stereotypes of laziness and being uneducated. And Pacific Islander and Asian Americans too. The old-fashioned, unenlightened parenting proverb comes to mind: children are to be seen and not heard. Methodists have been proud for Black and brown people to be seen. The shame is that the church has rarely heard or listened to the experiences of brutal humanities and deference and disregard and discriminations that they have experienced. somehow it takes a moment of crisis to focus our attention.
I think this matter of the paradox of our words as a church, but our actions historically, and the dissonance between the two cannot be understated enough. I think it's still experienced even to this day in the church by communities of color who are still waiting to be heard, who still experience the question of what do we do with our clergy of color when their white church, the white church they've been appointed to, says we're not ready for one of those yet. You know, we're still in those same conversations. And so as I turn to you, Dr. McLean, to help us to, you know, think a little bit more even about this the historical complexity that communities of color have with this church that we've contributed to, not only Black, but as Reverend Day said, Asian, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, Latinx, Native American have all made deep contributions with deep affection for the church, and to this day continue to experience oppression within it. You know, tease that out a little bit for us historically, because I think we will need to talk about, so then what does that mean for us now, this choice to be in a church while experiencing this exclusion, and what does it mean for the work of anti-racism and dismantling racism going forward?
Thank you, Erin. The history of African Americans and the Methodist movement in the United States is a story of pride and pain. Pride and pain. While Black people were attracted to and proud of the staunchly bold Methodist stance against slavery at the beginning, they were too soon to experience pain and to weep at its compromise and complicity on that issue and the issue of race and racism so many more times in Methodism's checkered history in race relations, even at this critical time in the nation's and the church's history. Let us be clear. There has been no Methodist church in the United States without Black presence. From Sam's Creek in Maryland, beginning with Annie Sweetser, to the very latest tick of the clock. And when the great respected African-American Bishop James Samuel Thomas closed the 1984 bicentennial General Conference meeting in the state of American Methodism's beginning in Baltimore, he was the president of the Council of Bishops, a Black man, a Black bishop, president of the Council of Bishops. He closed that General Conference with a prayer. Here are the words of his fervent prayer. Lord, lead us now to make new history. Gathered in that petition of those words and graciously aware of the pride and pain of his people, there was the history of the faith of a people and a hope through, though crushed by many foes, had not died. That faith had not died. In fact, he represented that moment, that hope, and the audacious hope of a people for Barack Obama. Lord, lead us now to make new history. Although Methodism had kept hope alive with the establishment of the non-segregated missionary annual conferences in the South after the Civil War, the planting of many schools and colleges, of which many still exist today as some of the finest academic institutions in the nation, Meharry Medical College trains physicians and dentists and researchers and health policy experts. 3 of the 4 graduates of Meharry's medical school go back to the communities from which they've come, the rural communities or the urban communities, and serve in those communities. United Methodist Church has African Americans now serving as outstanding pastors and bishops and district superintendents and board executives such as you, Aaron. And many of these persons many persons are now serving in what is called so-called cross-racial, I hate that term, cross-racial appointments. I think it's a terrible term. But anyway, there are blacks who are serving in churches that are predominantly white. But that hope has been painfully crushed several times by the earlier contagious virus of racism that inflicted the nation and the church. It was not just by the compromise on the issue of slavery, but also the surrender to segregation and Jim Crow, and the Machiavellian and contrived plot to establish a segregated central jurisdiction, which for the first time in the history of the Methodist Church made segregation the official policy of the church. I was ordained. I was one of the few people still living who was ordained. I was ordained in the central jurisdiction in the Central Alabama Conference in 1962. When the 1939 conference was met in Kansas City to unite the South and the North, they contrived a plan which was Machiavellian in nature to establish a segregated jurisdiction of the church. It was designed to satisfy the question of the Southerners, what shall we do with these Negroes? At that meeting, the Black Methodist delegates sat and wept, while the white delegates to the 1939 conference and their friends and their guests stood and proudly, triumphantly sang, "We're marching to Zion," while the black delegates sat and wept. They stood, but we wept. We sat and wept. When the United Methodist Church was being established with the merger of the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church in 1968, this new church boasted that it was the most multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic church in the nation. With almost 13 million members in the United States, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, and Caucasian Americans, the church had the possibility of becoming the leading racial justice church in America. The experience of the history, pride, and pain of the ethnic people of color, and the history of the pride and shame of the whole church equipped us for leadership, for racial leadership, for racial justice leadership. Martin King had just been martyred. The vote had been taken to abolish the racially segregated central jurisdiction. And it would seem that we were ready to become, in fact, what we said later we were: open hearts, open minds, open doors. But there was still the persistent, pestering, painful problem of individual and systemic racism. And until we dismantle and destroy the pillars that prop racism up, we shall be on the pain side of history rather than the pride side of history. The postponed 2020 General Conference, which will be now in 2021, gives us grace time. Grace time. Time for working to destroy and dismantle the pillars that prop up, undergird, and uphold racism. Now the question is, will we have the courage and the audacity to be really faithful to the liberating gospel of Jesus Christ? Or will we succumb and surrender our faith and cave in to the marketplace ideology of exclusion that pretends to have the answer to save the church? The question is definitely now before us.
I think what has been established by Dr. McLean and others is this difficult history that we have had racially in terms of our development as a church and our contribution to the development of the U.S. These pillars of racism that have shown themselves at various times throughout our history continue to endure today and are balanced on this foundation of white supremacist ideology. I want to turn now to Dr. Green to help us to think, understand the theologies of white supremacy, racialized violence and terror. How did this come to be a part of the narrative of the church and of Christianity, where the enmeshment of theology, patriotism is used to continually bring terror to communities of color? How do all of these ideologies and work together to get us where we are today?
Thanks so much for the question, Aaron, and thank you to my fellow panelists, because I've learned a lot from you all today. I'm going to start with Walter White, who investigated lynchings for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the 19-teens and 20s, and he later became head of the NAACP. He wrote a study of lynching in 1929, and in that he said, "It is exceedingly doubtful if lynching could possibly exist under any other religion than Christianity. Of all the great religions of mankind, Christianity is the only one to draw the color line and thus set up an elaborate array of invidious distinctions which assure the white Christian of his immense superiority." White didn't stop there. He appended to the document a table that showed, as he put it, an astonishing revelation of the almost exactly parallel curve upwards of lynching and of the Methodist Baptist percentage of the total of church members in those states where lynchings had occurred. In other words, there were more white Methodists and Baptists in places where there were more lynchings. So I want to ask the audience here to just take a minute to think about that claim and think about your reaction to it. My reaction 15 years ago when I first read Walter White as a white woman who grew up Southern Baptist was denial. I said, yeah, well, I mean, that's because the South is all Baptist and Methodist. This is correlation, it's not causation. Or I said 1929, I mean, that's the year my grandma was born. It's a different world now. Even then, as a would-be historian, I resisted any blanket characterization of white Christianity. Now we'd hashtag that, not all white Christians, not the true Christians. And it's an easy way out, right? I don't have to be associated with those Christians because they aren't the true Christians. I'm different. But this is the thing. There is no Christianity that stands apart from culture. White Southern Christianity developed alongside white racial violence and white supremacy. White Christianity theorized, justified, and sanctified racial terror. Now, white Christianity is in itself a really odd concept at first glance. There's just Christianity, right? The problem is that for most of this country's history, just Christianity meant white Christianity, and not only in the South. The Europeans who colonized the continent associated their own people with Christianity, regardless of individual practices. They dismissed the rich cultures of indigenous people whose land they claimed, and of African people whose bodies they enslaved, as heathen, even Africans who were Muslim or Christian. And as the ranks of Christians grew ever more diverse, the concept of race and of color hardened. Whiteness and American Christianity created each other, and each reinforced the other as the real way and the true way to be human. Now, as 19th century white Southerners fought to defend the practice of human enslavement against ever more vocal abolitionists, they idealized a hierarchical social order that they saw as ancient and biblical, but that was in fact almost entirely new and never a lived reality. Emerging racial science and literalist misreadings of scripture, especially the Curse of Ham and the Mark of Cain, buttressed those claims. White men, uniquely suited to mastery with this dream, stood at the top as protectors of white women who were sexless and deferent, and of white children. And you go down that hierarchy, and at the bottom of the hierarchy stood Black and Indigenous people, characterized by turns as childlike and violent, and always as incapable of self-rule. That was a vision of white Christianity that burned hot in the 19th century and then seemed to burn out when the secessionist states surrendered to the United States in 1865. It surged again, though, in the aftermath of Reconstruction as the defeated soldiers and their children fought to reclaim power and launched an era of racial terror in which lynchings became a sort of gruesome Christian ritual. The vision surged again in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, again in response to social programs designed to mitigate the legacies of racism and poverty, and again now in response to the election of the nation's first Black president and a new series of movements for Black lives. So why those surges? Those surges happened because this claim of white superiority, of white Christianity, never once for one moment stood uncontested. There were surges because generations of Black and Indigenous and immigrant and even white people, of poor people and working people, and even a few wealthy people, of Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and non-believers, people of all ages, abilities, and genders, have challenged and contested Christian white supremacy and patriarchy every step of the way. And here we are again today because we again face a choice about what kind of Christians and what kind of church we want to be.
We have some questions from our viewers that I want to throw out. For those of you who would still like to submit a question, we've got a little bit of time, but as you click on the button, you may have to exit the full screen view in order for you to submit your question. So if you're having some problems that you may want to reduce the view of your screen. First, I'd like to start with, whenever conversations about racism pop up, and then there is the need for, or the expressed need for us to revisit historically, because there are connections between what's happening now and what has happened in previous times, there can be a resistance to even engaging in a conversation about the past. I wasn't here when all that happened. Let's leave the past in the past. Don't stir up the pot. You're taking us back to those times is just a way to inflame sensitivities. As folks who work with history in a way that makes it accessible for people now, how would you say that, what would you say is the importance of reviewing the historical narrative in the present day work of dismantling racism? What's the connection that you see between the past and the present?
Erin, at GCAH, we like to think of our mission, and I think it applies perfectly here, that we understand the past in order to fully engage the present and envision the future true to our sources, true to what authentically makes us who we are. We can't be present, we can't plan the future unless we understand the roots that form and shape us. And the roots that form and shape us as people called Methodist, as Bobby and Dr. McLean and Dr. Dellinger have reminded us, have had people of color with us from the very beginnings of our life together. There has not been a time in Methodist history when we have not been engaged with with people of color. So we can't even begin to deal with the present unless we understand that past and what some of the sins and shames of that past have been, because of the people that it's hurt and marginalized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would, there are a couple questions here that deal with the integration of the church, of us living more intentionally as a diverse church. There's a question from Glendale United Methodist Church in Nashville that says, how do we work for intentional integration of our churches to combat the most segregated hour of the week? And how can we structure the leadership of the church to facilitate making this a reality? So I think this idea of integration is also one that has a lot of roots in our historical understanding, where there have been movements for integration, both in the church and in the larger society. Both of those movements for integration have garnered some critique. Wondering how do we define integration? I think I would like for us to start there before we get into the how. How will we define meaningful integration? Because in the case of Native people, in the case of African Americans, I think in the case of many communities of color, when we say integration, what that brings up images of assimilation. And the question has been, have our efforts for integration actually benefited those communities of color who have had to or have made the choice to work in partnership with, to be part of multicultural community, only to find their identity, their freedom of expression minimized and dismissed in order to be a part of the whole. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of integration and how can we have meaningful inclusion. And, what are the pitfalls of that? How do you all understand that from a historical perspective, and what it means to dismantle racism, to build a community, a faith community where all are truly welcome?
Aaron, it seems to be one of the errors we make and we continue to make, and one of the reasons why I don't like that term cross-racial appointments, one of the errors we make is that integration means that Black folk will come into white churches. That doesn't accomplish the beloved community. That does not accomplish the open doors, open hearts, and open hearts, whatever that expression is. That doesn't accomplish it. There ought to be an openness across the board. Why not whites come to Black churches? Most of them are more energetic and enthusiastic than most white churches. I pastored Union Church in Boston out of retirement for a year and worked with Union Church, a church now that is truly a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic church. During the year, I took in 45 people, 42 of them were under 30. But they were of all races, and they were Hispanic, they were Asian, they were Black, they were white. This is a historic Black church, and yet at this point, it has become that kind of welcoming community. People know when they're welcome, and in order for that there to be an inclusive church, there has to be the sense of people are thoroughly and genuinely welcomed into that community. I had an expression every communion Sunday, and we had communion twice a month. All means all, and I would have the congregation to repeat every Sunday. All means all. We've got to mean that all really means all.
Anyone else? Thoughts about inclusion, integration? How do we actually accomplish it in earnest in the church?
I would like to talk a little bit of the experiences that I've had in the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, which is unlike the Central Conference. It was initiated by Native people for Native people. Our churches already existed in Oklahoma and in the surrounding areas as indigenous family churches that sprung up after the forced removal from our homelands to Oklahoma. So you have generations of people who have lived and brought churches up, Christian churches. The goal is not and has never been for Euro-American ministers to come in and preach to us. What I have noticed is that many times people want to, particularly non-native people, want to come in and reaffirm their conviction that native practices prior to Christianity, cultural practices, are honored. And so they want things like, they welcome sage burning during worship. And oftentimes we're invited to come and speak and to represent indigenous representation, to add a certain flavor to white church. This is deeply damaging to us. I mean, if you consider the history of what the church has done, it has tried to decimate those same practices that it now wants to venerate and hold as a showpiece of worship, which is detrimental to spiritual well-being. It makes Christianity for Native peoples performative and not wholehearted and above board. And many times I think through ignorance of the history itself and the sense of trying to be welcoming, we impose standards and expectations of behavior upon indigenous people in ways that are not helpful and do not foster community and interrelationship in helpful ways for either party. My biggest concern when we talk about integration is who is being asked to do the work, who is being asked to show up and where the primary focus is to alleviate white guilt and to minimize the damage that's been done. We don't have leadership. We don't have voice as Native peoples the way that other peoples do, and that is by design. We don't have access to our own spiritual practices. We have adopted Christianity in many instances because it is a message of hope, because we see in Jesus somebody standing up against imperial powers that want to oppress indigenous persons. And I think that gets lost in this idea that we're all going to come together and play well in the sandbox that is church. And that is not church. Church is transformative. Church is meant to be revolutionary, and revolutionary on the side of love. And too many times I think we mistake culture, especially white Christian toxic culture, as normative. And those are the things that need to be brought to the table when we're talking about interacting. How are we furthering damage? How are we mitigating that damage? How are we allowing ourselves to make mistakes, to have hurt feelings, to really wrestle with the injustices that we've been left with and the presumption that we have about that normativity Thank you.
So, yeah, Dr. McLean, there are a couple of questions about the pillars that you mentioned earlier. So why don't you run through those really quickly for us?
I have them right here in front of me, Aaron, and I'll read them off to you. I'm going to write these up in a better fashion, but let me do it now.
Good.
Number one, individualism and an undeniable sense of privilege. These are the pillars of holding up racism. Number two, a false, repeated, and narrow media representation of people of color. Number three, an all-out segregation of persons of color in housing, schools, churches, government, and other institutions. Four, whiteness presented as the human and cultural ideal. Five, dishonest communication and the notion that race should not be openly discussed. Six, white privilege and white fragility as defined and discussed by Robin DiAngelo in that book entitled White Fragility. Number seven, incomplete, sometimes purposefully truncated and eschewed history to favor whiteness. And number eight, unconstructed, undisciplined, and unaccountable police power that yields and results in racial profiling, brutality, unfair charging, and sentencing, and all too often murder. Those are eight of. There's obviously more, but those are eight of the pillars of racism that upholds.
And we'll get those from you, Dr. McLean, and have them on the site with the resources. So if people want to refer to those later, they can do that.
Would be glad to do that.
Reverend Day, there are a couple of questions for you about John Wesley in particular, and one which says, what do you think John Wesley would say today to the UMC with respect to its practices and relative silence in our society on the evil of racism in its many permutations? And there was another question related to John Wesley and about his personal relationship with the institution of enslavement and his own proximity to enslaved persons.
Let me take the second part first. Wesley's proximity to enslaved persons certainly was pretty close, deeply discomforting, and very formative to his point of view as he lived in Georgia. And though Georgia, slavery was not practiced in Georgia at the time that he was there, he did see the wickedness of slavery along with his brother Charles in South Carolina, in Charleston, where they traveled back and forth, which was the port by which they traveled back and forth, to Georgia. The most telling thing about John Wesley for me at this point in time in the discussion about race relates to his letter to William Wilberforce the year before his death, after having read Equiano's Travels, which is a book like 12 Years a Slave, one that we would know, and his writing to William Wilberforce to say, fight the good fight. And in that letter to William Wilberforce, he uses the phrase to William Wilberforce, your work is going to be like Athanasius contra mundum, or Athanasius fighting for the Nicene Creed against all the opposition that faced. He said, you are going to be facing forces unlike you've never faced before when you fight this fight. So this is a fight that we're facing, that he faced in his day, and that he compels us to fight in our day, that is true to the baptismal vows we take about renouncing the spiritual forces of wickedness that we see in the wiles of racism, of racism in our time. So what he would say to us today is, you're in for the battle of your life. But best of all, God is with us, and God is on our side in that fight. So don't grow weary in the fray. Your way, the Christian way, is against the way of the world, against the way of racism, against the way of slavery, and will not abide it.
So, Dr. Green, in that vein of kind of this work of dismantling, as you have done research in kind of the growth of this white supremacist theology, there are a couple of questions about our biblical understanding of race and anti-racism and how that impacts even our way of engaging in this work. What does an anti-racist church look like in this day and time? What is it doing? What is it actively doing that is counter to the theology of white supremacy that is at the foundation of the church that we're now standing?
That's a great question. Thanks. And it's as I understand it, it's two questions, right? It's one about the sort of biblical histories of racism, and then a question about what churches can do. So to the first question, I think I'll answer it in a similar way that I would answer the question about why not just leave the past in the past. When people reflect on when white people reflect on the past of this country, white people often get very hung up on particular ways of reading and interpreting the Bible that emerged in the 19th century in defense of human enslavement. The sort of literalist readings, like I mentioned, of the Mark of Cain, the idea that the Mark of Cain was blackness, is something that emerged alongside the creation of whiteness. It has no theological or biblical validity, and I would equate it to the question about why leave the past in the past. When somebody asks that question, you ask them what they think about the Mississippi state flag coming down, or the nearest local monument, or the 4th of July. If they lament either of the first two or they celebrate the third, then you have the answer about what kind of past matters, right, to that particular person. They're not saying leave the past in the past. They're saying leave that past in the past. And what I think, and where I'll pull these two questions together, what white people have to do in the church, what an anti-racist church does, is it engages first. If you're looking at a white anti-racist church, a predominantly white anti-racist church, that church, first of all, makes space, real space, for non-white voices. And the white people in the church at that time just shut up. I think the responsibility of white people is to talk to each other, to talk to white people who don't get it, who don't want to talk about the past because they don't want to talk about the parts of it that are hard for them. I think a true anti-racist church makes as much space as possible for reflecting on and eradicating whiteness as a concept, and with it, both within readings of scripture, which is entirely ahistorical, and within the church.
Mm-hmm. So on the opposite side of this, as you talk about the need for white folks to talk with white folks to kind of interrogate their own sense of whiteness and their own racialized narratives, for communities of color, there's also work to be done in terms of thinking about our place in shaking off kind of these legacies of oppression and indoctrination that also live within us. There's also this question of reparations that's been asked and how that comes into play. Dr. Dellinger, you mentioned a little earlier about repairing harm and addressing historical harms, and how that has to be a part of the work that happens to end structural racism and to take on an anti-racist stance. So thoughts of repairing harm and what that looks like in a very practical way. Dr. McLean, you also talked a little bit about going into General Conference and some of the proposals that are going into that. I could see that could also be an opportunity to talk about the matter of repairing harm. So Dr. Dellinger, why don't you start, and then Dr. McLean, if you have any other thoughts about the matter of reparations.
Okay, human history is complex. And being human means that we all mess up. And Native nations were influenced by settler colonialism, by the need to survive, fit in, to accommodate. And as such, we've made many of the same mistakes that white culture has. In the South, you see Native Americans who held slaves themselves. I would say that in all instances, people of color, white people, we all need to look at our past and acknowledge how we have been influenced by settler colonialism, by the ideals of the past that we put in motion to selfish ends, and look at the ways in which we can acknowledge and repair those damages. It's hard to give a blanket answer as to how that's going to be, because it is such an individual, institutional, and community-based process, a long, hard process. Again, hard conversations, acknowledging our role in not only being victims of, but also participating in those systematic institutions that were imposed upon us in order to survive, to profit, to whatever. And I think that is something that we all need to be honest about. It is a hard conversation. And in order for it to be more than what I've heard termed as oppression Olympics, where we all fight over who's the worst oppressed and who owes who what, we need to acknowledge that the damage is mutual. White people have hurt themselves in this pursuit deeply, spiritually, and acknowledging that and dealing honestly with ourselves and with our history is going to be critical to any change.
Mm-hmm. No other people worked for nothing to build this country except Black folk enslaved, working from sunup to sundown, as my mother used to say, from kin to can't, from the time you can see to the time you can't see. No other people were forced to build this nation, including the White House, Black folk doing the White House. During the Black Power days, I wrote 2 or 3 essays on reparations. I'll dig some of those out, Aaron, and see if I can find what I wrote then, because I probably would still agree. But I was heartened the other day on that issue, on the reparations issue, by the mayor of Minneapolis. He was asked a question at a press interview the other day, where did he stand? And he said, I would fight for reparations. This is a white mayor of Minneapolis. We've come a long way. We got a long way to go, but there may be hope for the whole reparation issue, and I hope there is.
So there have been a couple of questions here sent in that talks about, where do we go from here? What are we actually going to do? What are some tangible steps that we can be taken and that can be taken? And I think, as Dr. Dellinger said, there are really no easy answers in dismantling the institution of racism that's generations and generations old. But I do think that a place to start is to interrogate the systems that drive the church. We have ways of educating and forming leaders, lay and clergy. If you look at how those systems of education and formation operate, embedded within them. We have systems that train and deploy clergy. If you look closely enough at those systems, you will find racism. We have a mechanism by which we make financial decisions and do financial projections about the future of the church. If you look closely enough at how those decisions are made in the local church, in your annual conference, in the general church, you will find racism. So we don't have to look far to see opportunities to begin the work of dismantling racism. You can start right in your church. You can start right in wherever your site of ministry is in the church, and beginning to look at these systems, how they function, because this is the machinery of institutional life that becomes the scaffolding for racialized oppression to continue to operate. And I think it brings in opportunities of how do we give people access to empowerment that haven't had it historically in our church, through education, through support for training. How do we make decisions that help to level the playing field? Economically, when we look at the disparities that exist between churches of color and their ability to maintain their ministry and white churches that are in similar situations. How do we look at churches that close versus the churches that are thrown lifelines? There are infinite number of places to begin the work of dismantling. There is no just one action that we can take, but it does include having these hard conversations about where we should start and how this is a time for us to take action. So, as one who does work on behalf of the denomination in anti-racism, I think that all of the ways in which we've been talking today, we've hinted on just a few as we've unpacked historically what it means to address institutional racism in the church, that there are more than enough, opportunities, and using the resources that are provided from the church. Someone sent in a comment about the Charter for Racial Justice from the United Methodist Women, which is one of our flagship statements on anti-racism, and could be a wonderful opportunity for local churches to begin their work on anti-racism. So I want to give you all the last word on this in terms of where do we go from here. If there were one thing that you would say would make the difference in terms of moving from simply talking about the need to be an open, affirming, inclusive, anti-racist church, to actually doing the work of it, what's the one thing? It doesn't have to be the only thing, but what is one thing that you would commend to our viewers today that's important to do this work?
From GCAH's perspective and the mission that it carries for the United Methodist Church, it will certainly be to raise up those histories that our churches and history teachers haven't taught us and have ignored, and move them to the place where they can be seen and are visible to all. And the second would be, like unto it, to make sure that we're paying as much attention to the collection of the histories of African American churches, Native American churches, Hispanic Latino churches, Asian American churches, and Pacific Islander churches as we do to white churches, because those disciplines and rigors have been very different in our history and cannot be going forward.
Aaron, I'm going to make available to you these 8 pillars, which I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to send you a copy of those. If every United Methodist Church took one of those, not all 8, just took one of those and said, we are committed, we as a local church are committed to working on this. I'm working on whiteness presented as a human and cultural ideal, or individual, or white privilege and white. Just take one of them. If every local United Methodist Church took one of them and said, we're going to spend at least 1 year working on this one thing that is anti-racism, I think we'd be doing we'd be taking a big step. And I'll send those to you.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I would just say you can't, to the question of reparations, you can't reallocate power without reallocating resources. And
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you.
I'd say to the question of reparations, you can't reallocate power without reallocating resources.
Amen.
You can talk about reparations on the federal level, but you can talk about it on the church level too. It almost happened in the 1970s in response to the Black Power movement that Reverend Dr. McLean was just talking about. And white reaction killed that in the white churches. This is another chance.
Amen.
Dr. Dellinger?
I think, again, we need to listen to one another. We need to know our history, what our history of not only the U.S. is, but our church is. And what do we need to do within that context to heal the community around us? What tangible ways can we reach out and acknowledge what has happened, what we no longer wish to see happening, and how can we tangibly take these resources that we do have and make a new plan, a new way to move forward together.
Thank you. Reverend Day, you have a prayer that you brought to share that will close the discussion time, and then I'll close this out.
Before he does, Aaron, could we ask him to send you a copy of that prayer so that that prayer can be shared as well?
Sure.
I will be happy to do that. Join me in prayer, everyone. Set us free, God of us all, from every bond of prejudice and fear, that honoring the steadfast courage of the likes of Harry Hoosier and Richard Allen and Joanna Lee and Absalom Jones and so many others throughout the years, we may show forth in our lives the reconciling love and true freedom of the children of God, which you have given us in your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen. I want to say thank you to our panelists today who have really shared a depth of information about our historical journey as a church and where the work remains unfinished. This is just the beginning of a conversation about what it means to dismantle racism and to press on to freedom. At some point, we've got to turn from our conversations back to our communities, to our homes, to our places of employment, to the streets to actually make freedom a possibility for all people. And so for the questions that didn't get answered today, we're going to send those to our panelists and see if there's some small videos that they may want to shoot to respond to them. But we've got to keep this conversation going, and we've got to keep the work of dismantling racism going. So we encourage you to keep an eye out for the next town hall meeting, which will be an intergenerational conversation about what we need to do to dismantle racism. Here we'll hear from young people who are in the forefront of the movement to save lives and to bring freedom to all of God's children. And we'll also be uploading more resources from our various agencies and resource persons around the connection so that you will have access to the tools that you need in your local context, in your life, and in your ministry to dismantle racism and press on to freedom. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us.